In a quiet suburban neighborhood, Magnolia Street seemed like any other. Identical houses with well-manicured lawns, white picket fences, and carefully trimmed trees. It was the kind of place where nothing extraordinary ever happened, or at least that's what everyone thought. Sarah and Mark had moved into house number 17 a little over 6 months ago. Since then, life had followed its usual course. Mark would go to work at his office, and Sarah would spend her days taking care of the house and browsing home decor blogs. The house, built in the 1950s, had a retro charm that Sarah loved. But it also had a few peculiarities that left her feeling uneasy. One of those peculiarities was the basement door. It creaked every time it was opened, as if it were protesting any attempt to pass through. Mark joked that the basement had a personality, but for Sarah, there was something more. A persistent, musty smell and a coldness that seemed to wrap around the place, even during the hottest days. That Saturday afternoon, Sarah was home alone. Mark had gone out for a last-minute meeting, and she finally decided to clean the basement. A task she had been putting off since the move. Armed with a flashlight, a dust mask, and rubber gloves, she thought the basement was just another room that needed her attention. When she opened the door, the familiar creak echoed through the house. A chill ran down her spine, but she ignored it. She carefully descended the wooden stairs, feeling the cold concrete floor beneath her feet. The flashlight's beam danced across the walls, revealing old stacked boxes, furniture covered with sheets, and a row of dusty mason jars on a shelf. Everything seemed ordinary, except for one detail. In the far corner, there was a chair. The chair, worn leather, was facing the wall. Sarah didn't remember seeing it during her previous quick visits to the basement. Maybe it had been there since they moved in, but something about it felt out of place. Curiosity got the best of her, and she moved closer. As she neared, she noticed something strange. The wall in front of the chair was covered in marked scratches and scuffs, as if someone had repeatedly scraped something against it. The feeling of discomfort intensified. Sarah leaned in to take a closer look, and realized the marks formed words almost faded with time. "Help me." Sarah's heart began to race. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and went out, plunging the basement into total darkness. She stood up abruptly, nearly stumbling, and then she heard it. The faint sound of a whistle coming from behind her, as if someone was imitating a tune. She turned around, but there was no one there. Only darkness and the cold that seemed to grow stronger by the second. With trembling hands, she found the switch on the wall and flicked it on. The bulb flickered before lighting up, casting a weak, yellowish glow. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, but the discomfort lingered. She quickly ascended the stairs, leaving the basement lights on, and slammed the door shut. In the days that followed, Sarah avoided the basement, but the whistling wouldn't leave her alone. She heard it at night as she tried to sleep, always coming from somewhere far away, like an echo inside her mind. Mark heard nothing and reassured her it was just the wind, but Sarah knew it was something more. Finally, on a night when the whistling became unbearable, Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She decided to confront whatever it was. She grabbed a candle and a match and went down to the basement again, but this time, the chair was facing her. With her heart in her throat, Sarah moved closer. Sitting in the chair was a figure worn, barely outlined by the flickering candlelight. It appeared to be a woman, with long, tangled hair covering her face. Sarah held her breath, unable to move. The figure slowly lifted its head, revealing a grotesque smile, and whistled the same tune, but now directly at Sarah. Sarah let out a scream and ran out of the basement, but the sound followed her, echoing through the house. She no longer knew what was real and what was a delusion, but something inside her had changed forever. The next morning, when Mark woke up, he found the house empty. Sarah had disappeared without a trace. In the basement, the chair was once again turned toward the wall, and on the floor, there was a melted candle beside a new inscription. "Help me," but now, instead of words almost faded by time, they were clearly visible as if they had been written recently. Have you ever had that feeling that something is wrong, but you can't quite put your finger on what it is? I felt that when I moved with my son, Noah, into a new house, trying to leave behind the remnants of a broken marriage. My name is Emily, and Noah is all I have left. He's 6 years old, smart and sensitive, with those big brown eyes that seem to take in the world in a way only children can. He's always been a quiet child, with an easy smile and endless curiosity. Since he was little, he loved exploring, discovering new things, and, like any boy his age, creating stories in his head. After the divorce, I knew we needed a fresh start. So when I found that cozy little house, with its white walls and a yard full of potential, I felt it was the right place. The street was quiet, with polite neighbors, and his school was just a few blocks away. It was the chance for us to start over, far from the painful memories of the past. At first, he seemed excited about the move. He explored every corner of the house with the enthusiasm of someone finding hidden treasure. He'd run from room to room, discovering new places to play, and I felt relieved to see him happy. But as time went on, that initial happiness started to turn into something I couldn't quite understand. Something dark, silent, began to settle in our home, and I wasn't prepared for what would come next. He always had a vivid imagination, like most kids. So when he started talking about a new imaginary friend, I didn't think much of it. It made sense that, amid so much change, he'd create a companion to cope with everything. He said the friend's name was Ben and spoke about him with such affection and familiarity that, for a while, I thought it was sweet. After all, what harm could there be in an imaginary friend? But gradually, things began to change. My son started to withdraw, spending hours locked in his room, talking to Ben, and his sweet personality began to disappear. The innocent play turned into outbursts of anger I had never seen in him before. If something frustrated him, he would yell, throw his toys on the floor with force, and give me looks that didn't seem to belong to a 6-year-old at school. The teachers reported that he was more reserved, preferring to be alone during recess, and when he did interact with others, it was often in a hostile way. The situation worsened when I started finding his drawings. Once colorful and full of life, now they were dark and repetitive. He always drew the same scene, him and Ben side by side, with empty and frightening expressions. I felt powerless, not knowing how to help my son. Something was clearly wrong, but I didn't know what. That's when I decided to seek help. I took him to a child psychologist, hoping they could figure out what was going on. During the sessions, he was reluctant to talk about Ben, but the psychologist believed that my son was dealing with feelings of guilt related to the divorce. He suggested that Ben might be a manifestation of that guilt, a way for him to express his fear and insecurity. During one of the sessions, he finally revealed that he believed Ben had been responsible for his parents' separation. The psychologist interpreted this as my son's way of processing the pain and feeling of responsibility for the family's breakup. I was devastated to hear this. The idea that my son blamed himself for the separation was unbearable. I began to follow the psychologist's recommendations to reinforce his emotional security, assuring him that he was not at fault for what had happened. But despite my efforts, his aggressive behavior only got worse. The conversations with Ben became more frequent and intense, and I felt like I was losing control of the situation. Then, one night, everything changed. I was lying in bed, almost asleep, when I heard my son talking in his room. It was late, and he should have been sleeping, so I got up to see what was happening. As I approached the door, I clearly heard his voice speaking softly. But what made me stop was that I heard another voice. A child's voice, low but distinct, responding to him. My heart froze. I stood there, not knowing what to do. The voice wasn't Noah's, I was sure of that. But how was that possible? He was alone in the room. I hesitated for a few seconds, battling the growing fear spreading through me. When I finally mustered the courage to open the door, I found him sitting on the bed, alone, staring into the distance, as if waiting for something. At that moment, a wave of confusion and dread washed over me. I wanted to believe that it was all just childish imagination, that maybe I was hearing things because I was tired. But that voice, it sounded so real. What if it was just my mind playing tricks on me? Or if there was something more, something I couldn't explain? To this day, I don't know what I heard that night. And to be honest, I may never know. But one thing is certain. There are moments when the silence in a house hides more than we can imagine. I've always loved adventures. That led me to a remote place, an old, forgotten cabin, deep in the middle of a dense forest. The plan was simple: spend the weekend away from everything. No phone, no internet, just me, my notebook, and the sound of nature. What I didn't expect was to find something far beyond what I imagined. I arrived in the late afternoon, with the sun already hiding behind the trees. The cabin was smaller than I expected, made of old wood with a door that creaked with every movement. On the outside, everything seemed normal, but there was something in the air that made me uneasy. Maybe it was the deep silence, broken only by the distant sound of birds. Or maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to move with the wind, distorting in ways that didn't make sense. Upon entering, the first thing I noticed was the smell of mold and old wood. The interior was simple. A single bed in the corner, a fireplace that didn't seem to have been used in decades, and a small table covered in dust. I dropped my backpack next to the bed and started exploring the place, hoping the unease would pass. But as dusk turned to night, the feeling that something was wrong only grew. After a quick meal and a frustrated attempt to light the fireplace, I lay down on the bed with my notebook, trying to write about the day. The silence was overwhelming, the kind that makes your ears buzz. Suddenly, I heard a strange sound coming from outside, like something scratching the cabin wall. My body tensed, and I forced myself to ignore it, thinking it might just be an animal from the forest. But the sound didn't stop. It continued, now closer, as if something was circling the cabin. I turned off my flashlight, trying to listen better. The scratching was accompanied by light footsteps, almost inaudible, but undeniably present. I closed my notebook and stood still, my heart racing in my chest. It wasn't my imagination. Something was out there, and it seemed to be watching me. Minutes seemed to drag on, each second heavier than the last. I gathered the courage and decided to look out the window. I slowly crawled to the edge of the bed, careful not to make a sound, and pulled back the dusty curtain a bit. Outside, the moon was high in the sky, illuminating the clearing in front of the cabin. And then I saw it. There was a dark figure standing near the edge of the forest, tall and slender. I couldn't see its face, but the shape was unmistakably human. My eyes widened as the figure moved into the light, revealing a pale, almost lifeless face with eyes that seemed to reflect the moonlight in a strange, unnatural way. I was paralyzed, unable to look away while that thing stood still, staring back at me. For a moment, I thought about screaming, but the words died in my throat. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished from sight, retreating back into the darkness of the trees. I tried to convince myself that I hadn't seen anything, that it was just exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. But the sound of the footsteps continued, now circling the cabin once again, stronger, more insistent. I returned to the bed, curling up under the blanket as if it could protect me. My breathing was heavy, my eyes fixed on the dark ceiling, waiting for the worst. Time passed slowly, and I lay there, trapped between fear and uncertainty, until the sound finally stopped. A deathly silence took over the place, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I knew that thing was still out there, waiting, watching. The night was long, and I couldn't sleep. Every little noise made me shudder, every shadow seemed to hide an unknown danger. But the figure didn't return. And when the first rays of sunlight began to break through the curtains, I finally felt a sense of relief. I was alive, but I knew something had changed in me. Something that couldn't be explained or forgotten. When the day finally dawned, I packed my things and left the cabin as quickly as I could. The clearing looked different in the daylight, less threatening, but the feeling of danger persisted. As I walked away, I looked back at the cabin one last time. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow move inside, but I decided not to investigate. I returned to the road, determined never to go back to that place. But even now, days later, I can't stop thinking about what I saw. Was I really alone that night? Or is the figure still watching me from afar, waiting for a new opportunity to reveal itself? I don't know, and maybe I never will. But one thing is certain. I'll never again underestimate what might be hidden in the shadows of a forest.